So we're it's not very good, is it? Practice social enterprise architecture practice based in Sheffield called Studio Polpo. We do quite a lot of sort of non-standard architectural things, I suppose, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Just a series of projects, but the main one, something we're involved with, where we kind of answered a call for artists, posing as artists, to do this project, and a little bit about our wider interest in sort of what we called experimental residential. So a couple of years ago there was a Festival of the Mind project which happens every 2 years, run by the University of Sheffield, which encourages collaborations between artists and scientists, and some of their projects were based in an empty ex-co-op department store in Sheffield, one level of which was called the Sheffield Bazaar, and they asked for calls for I think 10 different artists to do installations in the space. And we sort of used that as an opportunity to trial this, which we called Opera, which was something open public experimental residential activity, we called it, to try and set up a living space in this previous pharmacy for 10 days. The kind of festival section ran for 10 days, in which we would invite members of the public and guests to stay in a kind of hastily built B&B that we sort of built over the course of 2 days out of waste materials, and this was Opera 1. So this was the space, very small, 72 square metres. These dark pink things are where we sort of planned out bed spaces. You can just about see over here the sort of dining table. There's the windows to the street up here and some stairs that become a bit clearer in photos. So we very quickly, there's kind of grainy shot of the space, the shutters to the street. Very quickly, out of all sorts of scavenged materials, built partitions, sleeping spaces, and a kind of communal space, and had a provisional list of people who would come for a shared meal for a night, stay the night in this empty building with either myself or John or one of us from the practice, and talk about issues around living in the city, why no one really lives in the city, why it's only a certain demographic, different ways of using spaces, why people only live in buildings generally that are built specifically as houses, and who lives in buildings that are factories, and all of those sort of conversations. And we were kind of trying to provide a slightly different space within which these conversations could happen, and take people out of their normal sort of day-to-day routine and bring them together with other people to kind of make more interesting discussions. Some of these materials we use, these things for example, are what's left over from CNC cutting process. So we work with a company that makes a lot of products and furniture, and there's an automated machine that cuts those pieces out of plywood. These bits are left and they're generally burnt or thrown away, but they're very readily available and they're always the same size, so we had a kind of easy stock of those. So we played around with how we might layer them up, do things with them. We used quite a lot of removal blankets, which is just about see on the right. This is a kind of bed space. Again, not that easy. Can I just turn the light off? See if that helps. Because it is. So you get the full ambiance of bed chamber. So they were kind of basically pallets with mattresses wrapped in these removal blankets. This was again the window to the street. Curtains, kind of all mod cons. It was quite very cosy, and because we had lots of things like carpet underlay and things on the floor, it's quite sort of acoustically deadened. So it felt quite a kind of cosy, secure place for people to sleep in what was otherwise quite a sort of eerie building. And then just some of the photos of things we sort of put up. And as we kind of went through the project, we would be spending the day there, so we'd be sort of preparing for the evening, doing the washing up, doing very domestic things. Again, we found all this stuff outside the building. We found a sink, we cut a hole in a door and made a worktop. There's no running water, so we've kind of had to keep filling up a tank of water, and there's no plumbing obviously, so the bottom of the sink was a bucket. Very much a kind of hand-to-mouth existence. But it became very interesting doing very sort of mundane domestic things in this kind of big shop window essentially. So there's people going about their day-to-day business and seeing us kind of peeling potatoes or doing the washing up. It's kind of very interesting to look out of that, because I suppose in a lot of houses you haven't really got that connection with the street or that sort of that vision of what's going on. People did look in a bit so in a sort of strange shocked way. And people would bring food, which we'd cook sort of earlier on, so that would generally be bought for the meal, and then we'd do something with it the next day. So it's kind of a bit improvised. We had a slow cooker because there was only electricity. And it was quite interesting because the people running the project, although we said we're going to set up a house for 10 days, They're like, yeah, but you're not gonna, you're not gonna live in it, are you? We're like, well, yeah, we're gonna sleep in here, we're gonna cook in it. And gradually, as these things became apparent, they're like, hang on a minute. So okay, well, you're not allowed to use the front door to the street because that might be a security thing and need, I don't know, fire extinguishing. You need to put a sign up about this, and we were kind of very well behaved, but it's kind of against people's, coming up against their kind of comfort and sort of comfort zone of what was possible, I suppose. And there was always security in the building, and the security guards came and had tea with us and stayed in it a few nights because it was more interesting than pacing around an empty building with a torch. And it became kind of a very sort of a nice little kind of hub where there'd always be, you could always get a cup of tea, or you could always come and sit around and there'd be something cooking within sort of quite a sort of an odd space. We also, some of the guests that we invited started to do different things. So one was a filmmaker who brought along a few films that he'd done and of other people's films. So one night there was a film screening in one of our double bedrooms that we disconnected for that purpose. We had a screen printing evening, playing music, kind of zine thing, a workshop around sort of toilets and gender identity in toilets. So all sorts of things that some of the people who invited wanted to do as a sort of after dinner activity happened, some quite varied things. All sorts of kids and different groups sort of for meals. And it was a very kind of hard work. It was quite a grueling 10 days, and then we had to sort of pack it away again and sort of hide it all. And we made kind of a conscious decision not to photograph or film or anything, because we just wanted to see how it went. And we didn't have a particular outcome in mind. We just wanted to see what conversations came up, what connections were made between people, what the experience would be like being in this space, just if we could do it. And just, it was quite an open-ended thing. And we did leave diaries in the rooms for people to fill in, which were sort of done, a little bit. But it wasn't very heavily documented. And it led to a second project, which we then ran. So that went for 10 days. Then we looked at working with an organisation called Theatre Delicatessen here in Sheffield, who had taken over the empty Woolworths building on the moor. So it's a very big space for theatre companies. And we again built a very similar setup, a little bit larger, but the same sort of principles. This is the top left is the kind of dining end of it. And one of the ideas there was to make it a little bit less intense. So we do sort of the sleepover performance, as we called it, once a month, and then in between times, because of the sort of bedroom setup, the performers and people sort of putting on theatre productions there used it as dressing rooms or sometimes to sleep over. And often, the way Theatre Delicatessen worked there, it's for sort of emerging theatre companies, people just trialling out new plays, people who might have travelled without much money and actually then having to sort of find a B&B or a sort of travel lodge somewhere would sort of make it impossible. It kind of offered a place for them to stay. So that was quite interesting. It didn't coincide with what we were doing too much. So we ran a couple of events there, one of which was filmed. I can kind of give a link to that. It's kind of quite interesting. The filmmaker who came to the first event then documented the second one, because we thought, well, we would like something that does encapsulate that experience. So the kind of shots on the right are various people who came to one of the events talking about their experience of it and what they sort of found out. This stayed up quite a long time, and then that one stopped. And the next opera project we're looking at, I'll come on to in a little bit. So this is still from the first one, where we had all the things you need for a house, like a disco ball and tablecloths. And it was a very enjoyable space. I think one of the things to point out when I talked about the windows was actually that thing of having very domestic things going on, washing up, people chatting around a table, visible on the street through the shop window, kind of, I think, made the space feel quite safe. It was very much a sort of cut through between pubs or people waiting for buses, quite a lonely place in the evening where all the shops have shut. And actually seeing people living there and having that kind of 24-hour life that's not just kind of going out and drinking was kind of quite interesting for the area, I think. And then since we've done the first two operas, we've started to kind of write about them and reflect on them a little bit, done a few talks a bit like this, presented some of the findings in a sort of more academic way at conferences to try and say, well, what's been the point of this? What have we learnt from it? How might it inform other projects? And I suppose that's got documented a little bit more as we've gone on. And one thing we'd like to try with Opera 3, which is kind of sketched in on the right there, is something about maybe building the space, say, from scratch. So we've always kind of inhabited spaces before, and that's quite interesting, and we potentially do that again. But somehow looking at a way of building something from scratch that is also then inhabited maybe by the people who built it, but again by a kind of succession of visitors, and it might be a temporary thing that might pack away and move to another spot. And there's been a couple of sites that we've looked at, maybe in Sheffield, but that's our sort of next goal for Opera. So it's a sort of an open-ended project, and as we've sort of done it, various things have sort of come out of it that have been really interesting. One of which was this, which as a sort of direct result of this, one of the people who was, I suppose, involved in the Festival of the Mind and commissioning it, saw this building, which is in Sheffield, had a sort of interesting history, which at one point it was partially a funeral parlour, so it's kind of got a bit of stained glass and a kind of body trolley still there, very clean. And then it was Ruskin College, so it's been used as for teaching spaces. It's quite kind of an odd but kind of well preserved building next to this big Jury's Inn hotel here, and they wanted to create a mixture of studio spaces and sort of live work space. I think there's probably in Rotherham, but certainly in Sheffield, there's a lot of very informal live work where people will rent studios as kind of an artist space and live in it because it's cheap and no one really cares. And they were quite interested in making that, formalising that a little bit more and saying it is a kind of mixture of studios and living space. It doesn't have to be kind of under the radar or in this sort of grey area. We can sort of promote it and say, here's a really interesting mix of stuff, do you want to come and live here? Can you sort of design this for us? And we said, well, have you got any money? And they said, no, obviously, no one ever has any money. And we said, okay, so we've managed to get a grant to investigate this kind of model. So we put that towards starting to do the more, I suppose, kind of more normal things that we do, like getting plans of the building, looking at how they might subdivide it, how all that might work. And then they came up against a barrier, which was there was a kind of legal covenant on the building that said it couldn't be used in the way that they wanted it to. So then we got the money, but they couldn't really use it. So what we did with that is we decided to create a document, a piece of research that kind of could look at all the issues involved, like why that didn't happen, what you might do in a similar circumstance with another building, how people might take on spaces in the city, what the issues are around planning, building regulations, fire, what are you allowed to do, what aren't you allowed to do. Not kind of totally comprehensive, but I think because some of us in the practice also work in academia, we're kind of very aware that there's a huge amount of really interesting, useful stuff done that just stays within academia, and it's not kind of just made available to people who could act on it. And some of us have started to do things which have become directly used, which they've kind of called activist research, where you do a piece of work and then that is given to people who can then act on it. And so we felt quite strongly about doing something that could then be made freely available as a newspaper and online, that people could just get and say, okay, I'll pick this up. How could I do this? So we looked at all sorts of issues around what the kind of landlord structures might be and responsibilities. What can you live in and what can't you live in? Is it illegal to live in a factory, or do you have to kind of change the use class? All these kind of different things that we put into this. And the idea was that we printed a kind of a fairly substantial stack, and they were kind of handed out to various people. They were put in sort of community buildings, just so people could pick them up and hopefully every now and again act on something and go, oh, let's try and get together with this. So it covered all sorts of things. One thing it did was kind of showing precedents, so examples where this has happened before. So various things. This is one from Germany, from Hamburg, just to kind of give people kind of clues and say, well, you could look at this for an example. There's lots of different models. There's lots of ways that this kind of stuff can happen. This was kind of looking at, I mean, fairly sort of mundane but very important things, like, you know, if you take on the building, are you the landlord then, and what are you responsible for, and how do you set up structures for people to pay? If you're all kind of doing it together as a co-op, does someone become more sort of responsible than others, and does that cause issues? So there were sort of fairly straightforward practical things that we looked at. And we also charted, this is kind of a little snapshot of it, but we sort of charted the timeline of this particular project, so how it started, how people had found the building, how it kind of could have worked, why it didn't work, where it stopped. And I think very often, you know, when people kind of do reports of things or kind of write them up afterwards, it's always like, why it was all so amazing and everything was great. And that's, you know, it can be a bit depressing if you're doing something that isn't really working, but also it's not always that useful if you're not reflecting on where the dead ends were and what sort of didn't happen. So that's kind of another part of that. So, and it also then showed, yes, it stopped for this reason, but how it could then carry on and what you might do if that legal covenant issue hadn't cropped up. Another thing we did as part of that, we tried to get together various people, primarily from the council, so planners, kind of housing officer, someone who's looking at sort of self-build opportunities in the city, people who were involved with letting out kind of studio space in the city, and just tried to have a kind of fairly informal conversation around a meal, and that's something we've tried to do a little bit more after operas. Instead of saying, can we set up a meeting, which will be in your sort of slightly unpleasant council office somewhere, do you just want to come for lunch around our table and we'll just talk about it, and it gets people's guard down a little bit and they're maybe a bit more informal about things. So we had, again, not totally comprehensive, but quite an interesting meeting about, so we could say to the planners, are you allowed to do this and that and the other, what are the kind of planning issues around it, or to the housing people, is there a push to get more housing in the city centre, because there's, like Rotherham as well, a huge amount of empty space, and I think there's always been this odd thing in Sheffield where certain huge city centre retail developments never happened, and there's always this kind of rumbling thing, so things get knocked down, things are empty, things are kind of made into temporary shops or shop windows to make it look a bit busy, but there's only so much you can do with that, and I think there's a real awareness of that for everyone. And we were particularly, certain bits, like the Moor, there's all this stuff above shops that's just empty, we don't know quite who it belongs to, it's not used for storage, it is totally empty. And they're just like, they'd be amazing flats, you're right in the middle of town, you've got a huge amount of light, kind of massive bits of column-free space, they're great to live in, and they're not actually in a bad condition. So we were sort of saying, why isn't this stuff used? What are the barriers to it? Is it landlord issues? Is it planning things? What could we do some of this? And we were kind of, with the experimental residential paper, we were quite keen to sort of try and get that to lead to some sort of test pieces. So I think we talk in the film that was made about prototyping, so we'll often make bits of things, we might test a bit of structure or make a kind of mock-up of something, and we said there's a lot of things around pop-ups and pop-up shops and pop-up cafes. What are the issues around sort of pop-up housing, and how precarious can that be? What do you need to put in place to make that kind of work, and how can you do it in a way that doesn't have to be secret, because again it does happen a lot, but could you sort of celebrate it and say, okay, we're going to do this for 6 months, people might sign up for it totally in the knowledge that that's when it comes to an end, so no one's getting kind of evicted before being ready, and there again there's a lot of interest, but not kind of not enough from any one party to sort of really push that, but it's an interesting area. And then the other thing we did is that we started tampering it, so talking about prototyping, we started sort of fiddling around and tampering with physical intervention. So again, if you're taking on somewhere temporarily, you're not going to spend a lot of money on kitting out a building if you're only going to be there for a year, or the whole reason for going there is that you haven't got much money. And a lot of that was around comfort, particularly kind of staying warm and thermal comfort in the winter, because there's a load of great space. Often it's got actual holes in, or it's just built very thinly. And one of the things we thought was, particularly from our office, which is a similar sort of building, you say, well, could we do something to the windows? Could we reduce heat loss through the windows in a kind of very temporary sort of clip-on way? So we started testing all sorts of ways of making secondary glazing. So what could you do as a second layer within the window that would reduce heat loss, that you could remove and maybe take with you to your next temporary space? So that started kind of fairly, not high-tech, but maybe more elaborate than it needed to be, with these kind of CNC cut corners that could clamp glass or plastic. And it gradually got less and less and less. We're playing around with different types of plastic and cheapness and size and all sorts of things, and getting a bit kind of technical with thermal imaging and seeing if it actually worked, and it did. And then the kind of very reduced version was just these little clamps holding plastic sheets in the corners that could be sort of screwed into the corners of windows, and actually, it kind of depends on the situation. That made a huge difference. And in our office, we just ended up just using the plastic and just kind of wedging it in, and you take it out when it starts to get warm somewhere around August-ish, and then when it gets nippy again, like October maybe, you can pop it back, and it's it doesn't cost much, it's like £100 for a room this size or something, and it made a big difference. So you could put the heating on without it just going straight out the window. So that was a kind of interesting little bit of, I suppose, more technical fiddling around. But again, it was this idea of not everything has to be permanent and cost thousands of pounds, but it is important to be sort of comfortable to make the spaces work. So there, there's more, I suppose that's kind of from the most experimental kind of arts-led thing going into the sort of the kind of research part, and then I was going to talk a little bit about two other sort of slightly linked projects. So one was then we thought, well, could this, when it didn't, all these things happen at slightly sort of sliding timescales, but this was looking at an ex-medical instrument factory again in Sheffield, with a view to turning that into a kind of bigger live workspace, so potentially flats on the upper floors and then studios, club or kind of music space lower down. And again, it's amazing building, really good sort of structure, only recently vacated, single glaze, so freezing, but just fantastic space. And we looked at all sorts of ways of how that might work. And what started to be interesting here, it kind of comes back to this idea of timescale, so how it might work with phasing. So rather than saying, blimey, this is a massive building, it's going to cost a huge amount of money, how are we going to do this? Saying, well, can you get in the more rough and ready things, the people who want a studio space and can maybe do something temporary in the windows, or somewhere where you want to do an exhibition and it doesn't really have to be warm because people are coming in their coats. You start to do that, you get the revenue in a bit. You start to do sort of studio spaces on the lower floors, and then gradually you're kind of working with this kind of phased program where the kind of housing things happen, at a later stage. And once you kind of sell off part of it to members of this group as kind of flats, then that money goes back into sort of fitting out other things. So it's again looking at how timescales might work, and this kind of meanwhile bit in a different way. So not a sort of pop-up thing, but a kind of phasing. And that was a really exciting project, and we sort of looked at all sorts of interesting things to do with the building, and explored all sorts of ways of funding it through different people and different sort of setups. And it was very easy to sort of demonstrate that you could pay back a loan or a mortgage from kind of artists and studio rent, but getting the money in the first place to buy it was impossible. And then someone came and sort of paid cash and then just got it. So that was unfortunate. And even more unfortunate, they've just sat on it to land bank it because they know the value will go up, so there's nothing happening with this building, which is kind of hugely frustrating. And one of the organisations we worked with is now potentially looking at renting it off them. It's kind of just like, but yeah. No. And then on a different note, something that is sort of happening is we then worked with a group in Sheffield who had seen a kind of building, which is this grey block, which was a kind of stately home of sorts for an ex-mayor of Sheffield, who was big in steel, as they were, and then became used by the NHS, and then the NHS sold it because they've been consolidating all of their sort of properties. And this group of friends, about 12 people at that stage, in their sort of 50s and 60s, bought the site, and we were chosen to do a sort of housing development for them as a co-housing setup. So turning the house into flats and big shared areas, so the bigger spaces like living rooms and things, which are kind of overscaled for a normal domestic living room, would be shared, and then they'd make some of those spaces into flats and then build five new houses out here. And it was and is a very sort of long, drawn out decision-making process. Although they've known each other for a long time, there's quite complicated things to sort of agree. There's sort of financial things coming into the equation. And there we've had to sort of, it's just starting on site, so it will be built. There'll be kind of fairly well-performing new buildings. But it was quite an interesting process to kind of get them to kind of, in effect, co-design that and work with them to sort of say, well, we have an expertise, but they're your houses, and that sort of back and forth of how much does each party influence has been kind of quite interesting, but at times very frustrating and very difficult for everyone, I think, but kind of getting there. We did all sorts of work with kind of ideas of precedents and talking about why people like certain things. Again, we introduced this meal idea where we had a big introductory meal and we produced a big tablecloth and menus of questions so we could start this initial discussion going. Seems like 1,000 years ago. But it was about 3 years ago, I think, so it has taken quite a long time. And then working through, all sorts of different, more conventional architectural ways of working, of models, and actually making models for them to take home over Christmas and play around with and get an idea, get their heads around. Because I think, it's really important for people to understand the process and what they're getting, and actually there's only so far you can go with sort of computer visuals, because very often it's a static thing. We often take a computer model to meetings so you can kind of navigate around it, but actually taking their individual sort of houses at quite a big scale home, they started making kind of plasticine furniture for them, which was quite interesting. So measuring their own furniture and saying, well, where's my piano going to go and how's this going to work? So that, we didn't quite expect that. That was quite an interesting outcome. And again, they're looking at a kind of very, something that's happening kind of increasingly, this kind of co-housing model of no private gardens and a lot of shared space. And I suppose on the one hand, you think that's kind of straightforward because they've known each other for 20 years or something, but it's again quite interesting once you get into the details because they had to then pick which of the new houses they were going to have. So that wasn't agreed to start off with. It's much more of a collective shaping the kind of sites and where the buildings go and how you fit them on. And then who do you choose, who has which one? And then, oh, hang on, but if you look out of your bathroom window, you're going to see me when I go out my patio door and I don't really want that. And they're like, well, what's the problem with that? I've known you for 20 years. And all these little things about kind of overlooking and sort of private space come out, which kind of quite interesting. And I think didn't really lead to any fights, but it just, once people take ownership, even though they're not saying, there's a garden sort of split off here, this is one house, this is another, this is a fifth one, and there's two here. Actually, because this is kind of allotments and communal space, the person in that house then sort of felt a bit vulnerable. There's all sorts of discussions with the people here, thinking they're too close to this one, and it was quite an interesting process of negotiation, and very kind of tellingly at the start when we did various options of thousands of options of where things could go, but we got people to vote on what their favourite layouts were, and the people who were going to end up here tended to favour the options where these were as far away as possible. So it's little things like this kind of human nature, I suppose. But that was a different type of sharing, and in its own way, kind of experimental for these guys. And it's not kind of radical, but it's not the norm, I suppose. And then we just slightly tried to map different things onto this diagram. So I think it comes back along to sort of our interest in how we can make things kind of happen in a meanwhile, but in a sort of meaningful meanwhile. So things can be allowed to be a bit flexible. I think a lot of our discussions when we did the experimental residential, a lot of the things that were quite interesting were these kind of grey areas. So what you're kind of allowed to do and what people actually do. Actually, if you're living somewhere that's not a house, that's kind of fine if that's what you want to do. But then there might be kind of fire issues, so it might be actually very dangerous. So we were kind of not torn, but we were in this sort of interesting position of wanting to kind of encourage the more unusual kind of quirky stuff and being in touch with a lot of that, because a lot of that happens with people we know. But then also saying, well, but you want to make sure if you are kind of sleeping in a corner of this massive warehouse that if it all starts burning, you can get out, because actually that is quite important. So often it's the kind of planning and building regs where the planning, you think, well, you can keep things quiet, they're so sort of understaffed that they're not going to go snooping around every building to see who's living there. But actually there is a sort of responsibility to kind of keep people safe. And I think that was interesting from the kind of the opera things where we sort of went into it answering a call for artists, so kind of as artists, I suppose, but still with this kind of professional duty of care, architectural kind of side as well. So I think that kind of trying to bring those two together is something that crops up quite a lot in what we do, and sort of saying, oh, you should just do this and don't tell anyone, otherwise it won't happen. And then at what point you have to go, well, actually we have to kind of, you have to submit this to planning and it has to be a kind of proper thing. And it's, I don't know, it's kind of a constant sort of tension, I suppose, but you do become aware that a lot of things would never happen unless people just got on with them and did it, and then it becomes established, and then it becomes sort of, made a little bit more feasible. And that's the end of the talk.